Do you read me? Since we're not going to fit any more people in here, we might as well start. Well, I'm going to start by presenting a 14-minute video which introduces the basic subject of free software as quickly and clearly as can possibly be done. I practiced that talk several times before I gave it, so it came out very well. Let's go. Free software is the first battle in the liberation of cyberspace. Who controls your computer? Is it you, or is it some big company that's really controlling it? Well, what is a computer? A computer is a universal machine. It will do any computation you want it to because you give it a program that says what the computation is that you want. So the computer only knows how to get out an instruction and do it, and get out another instruction and do it. The program has the instructions. It says what to do. So by writing the right program, you can make it do anything. Well, almost anything. So who gives the instructions to your computer? You might think it's obeying your instructions when really it's obeying somebody else first, and you, only as much as that company wants it to, will let it listen to you. With software, there are two possibilities. Either the users control the program or the program controls the users. It's inevitably one or the other. So in order for the users to control the program, they need the four essential freedoms. And that's the definition of free software. Free software respects the user's freedom and community. Now, we often call it libre, using the French or Spanish word, pronounce it as you like. The point is, that's what we mean. We don't mean it's gratis. We're not talking about price. We're concerned with your freedom. And we sometimes say free/libre to show that. So freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish for whatever purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code of the program and change it so it does the computing you want it to do. But what is the source code? Well, every program typically will have two forms. There's the form that you can read and you can understand if you know the programming language. That's the source. That's what programmers write and change. Then there's the executable, which is a bunch of numbers which even a programmer can't figure out. If all you get is the executable, it's a horrible pain in the neck to figure out what it does, and even harder to change it. So to give you the real possibility to study and change it, they've got to give you the source code. That's a requirement. Well, with those two freedoms, each user separately can make a copy and start changing it and make it do what she wants. That's individual control. But what if you're not a programmer? You look at the source code and you don't understand it. Individual control isn't enough. We also need collective control, which means any group of users are free to work together to adapt the program to what they want. Of course, in the group, some of them are programmers. They're the ones who actually write the changes, but they're doing it as part of the group for what the group wants. Of course, the group doesn't have to be everybody. So others can use it some other way. They're all free to do that. So collective control requires two more essential freedoms. Freedom 2 is the freedom to redistribute exact copies, to make the copies and then give them away or sell them when you wish. And freedom 3 is similar, but it's for your modified versions. You're free to make copies and then give them or sell them when you wish. So if you do have these freedoms, then it's free software. The users control the program. But if any of those freedoms is missing, then the users don't control the program. Instead, the program controls the users, and the developer controls the program. So that means this program is an instrument of unjust power for its developer over the users. That means the users don't have freedom. That's non-free proprietary software, which we got to get rid of. Well, when you've got proprietary software, what happens? Sometimes the program snoops on the user. Sometimes it tracks the user. Sometimes it restricts the user and stops users from doing what they want to do. You can see that the blue ray is your enemy. Sometimes the software remotely deletes books, as Amazon did with 1984. Sometimes the developer compels users to install a harmful upgrade by threatening to take away other functionality if it's not installed, as Sony did. And sometimes they can even forcibly change the software at a distance, as Microsoft can with Windows through the universal backdoor. So sometimes they even sabotage users, as Microsoft does when it tells the NSA about bugs in Windows so it can use them to attack people's computers. Well, what you get is basically, with proprietary software, the owner has power over the users and takes advantage of this power, putting in those various malicious functionalities to hurt the users. Of course, they don't do this because they're sadists. They're doing it just for money, for greed. They have various ways that they can profit from having this power over users, which does not make it even the tiniest bit less evil. But they have no shame about it. They have conferences where they talk about the latest ways they can take advantage of users through the power they have. Basically, proprietary software, which is now from almost all the users of proprietary software, they're using proprietary malware. It's software for suckers. So how do you stop being the victim? Formerly, you had to stop using computers, but not anymore. Now you can come join us in the free world that we've built. In 1983, I announced I would develop a completely free software operating system called GNU. In 1992, we had it almost finished, but one piece was missing, the kernel. Linus Torvalds in that year freed his kernel Linux, which filled the last gap and gave us the first complete system you could run on a PC, GNU plus Linux. So, unfortunately, having freedom at one point doesn't guarantee you'll keep it. There are over 1,000 different variants of GNU/Linux. They're called distributions. A few of them are entirely free software. Most of them have non-free software added because they're maintained by people who aren't concerned about freedom. They'd rather add convenience at the cost of freedom. So you have to check which is a free distro. To keep your freedom sometimes requires a sacrifice, sometimes a big sacrifice, as at Lexington. Sometimes, but in our campaign, they tend to be little sacrifices. Anybody with a little bit of maturity can make these sacrifices. For instance, you want applications, but some of them are non-free. If you want freedom, you got to do without them. So there may be some inconveniences you have to suffer for your freedom's sake. Then many websites send non-free programs written in JavaScript to the user's browser. If you don't want to run non-free programs, you should install Libre.js, which keeps out non-free JavaScript. And sometimes servers will offer to do your computing. They say, send us all your data, obviously for suckers. Then the server does the computing and sends you back the results. But you're not supposed to think about what's happening because it's a cloud and you don't see what's going on. Well, you should look. It's service as a software substitute, and it takes away control of your computing. So a large fraction of the world's web servers are running GNU/Linux and other free software. But I think the most important computers to put freedom in are your computers, not companies' web servers. They deserve freedom also. But above all, it's people that deserve freedom. So we need to advance, and to do that, we have to cross obstacles. One of them is there are big companies that make a lot of money by having control over users, and they don't want to let us advance. We have to overcome their opposition. Another is that the mainstream media don't talk about free software. They have a term that they use to bury these ethical issues. They say open source instead. Now, it talks about more or less the same programs, but with different ideas, where free software activists say, this is a matter of right and wrong. Users deserve freedom. We demand freedom. The people who say open source, they don't want to say that. So instead they say, let the users change the software and redistribute it, and they'll make the code better. They'll fix some bugs. It may be true, but it's a less important issue. If we want to keep our freedom, we've got to talk about freedom. So say free software, and you're helping us every time. Another obstacle is that lots of schools teach non-free software, which is basically like teaching the kids to smoke tobacco. It's implanting dependence, which is the opposite of what schools should do. A school should prepare citizens to live in a strong, capable, independent, cooperating, and free society, which means teaching free software in the school. But there's another reason to do that for education. Some kids want to become programmers. They're curious. They want to know how the programs work. Well, the one who's studying a free software can understand it. The one who's studying a non-free program can't learn anything because the knowledge in the non-free program is withheld, denied to the students. So to uphold the spirit of education, the school should make sure its programs are free. But there's an even more important reason. Schools should teach the spirit of goodwill, the habit of helping other people. So the class should say, if you bring a program to class, just as if you bring cookies to class, you've got to share it with everyone else. Can't keep it to yourself. You've got to share the source code so other people can learn. So don't bring any proprietary software to this class. The school has to set a good example by following its own rule. It should bring only free software to class, except as a reverse engineering exercise. Another obstacle is there's hardware we don't know how to write free software for because they won't tell us how to use the hardware. That's shocking. They want to sell you the product and they won't tell you how to use it. They say, here's a non-free program you can use, run it and shut up. Don't bother us. Well, how do we find out how to run that hardware? With reverse engineering, you've got to study all those zeros and ones to figure out what they really do and write down how to use that hardware so someone else can write the free program to do it. It's hard work, but it can be done. If you want to make a big technical contribution, that's what you should do. Each new area, activity of life can bring with it new human rights that are necessary. And the human rights depend on each other. If you lose one, it becomes harder to maintain the others. So nowadays, computing is so important in society that the freedoms of free software are among the human rights that society must establish and protect. Thus, how to help? Well, you can write free software. You can organize groups to campaign and persuade schools and governments to move to free software. You can help other people when they have trouble using free software or help them install it. You can say free software and spread the philosophical ideas. Moving to free software is the first step in the liberation of cyberspace, but of course we also use the internet. We need other freedoms there, like network neutrality and putting an end to surveillance of people in general.
So, I hope that gave you a good basic understanding of free software, but there's a lot more to know, and fully understanding it involves understanding how these basic points work out on specific issues. So that's why I'm here to say somewhat more. First of all, about digital restrictions management, DRM. That is the malicious functionality of stopping users from making copies to share. Now, people should be free to make and share copies of any published work, exact copies, that is. And laws that forbid it are unjust laws, and technology designed to stop people from doing it is mechanizing the injustice. So publishers have invested in various systems to make it impossible to copy and share. And each one we have had to fight against. DVDs were designed to restrict people, but a clever programmer found a way to decode the encrypted DVD. Good. Well, that's at least one problem that has been defeated for those who get that software, although governments are on the side of the restrictors, and in many countries they've made it illegal to have a copy of that program. I decided not to have it. I just don't use DVDs with DRM. I decided I can live without them. Then nowadays there are network disservices. I don't call them services, I call them disservices, because if you use them, they do you a disservice. For instance, Netflix and Spotify, other kinds of streaming disservices. And they distribute an encrypted program, and it takes a non-free client program to decode it and display it, and they even corrupted the hardware. PCs nowadays are designed so that they encrypt the data going to the screen. And the screen is designed to decrypt that data. And this is just to make sure you can't connect some simple monitor to the machine and save the unencrypted video. So the hardware itself has been perverted by the desire to impose restrictions on cooperation between people, which means it's a matter of divide and rule. Keep users from helping each other, that's dividing them, and the goal is then to have power over them all. So, on principle, I simply don't ever run anything that would activate such restrictions. If you're running a free operating system, well, if your kernel, say, is Linux, it won't be enabling the encryption of your screen data. If you play anything on a GNU Plus Linux system, it will be playing unencrypted. But you don't have to go to the trouble to put something into your video path in order to save an unencrypted copy, because your system won't be sending it encrypted at all anyway. Now, the freedom to share is part of the freedom to cooperate with other people, to form a society rather than an evil empire. And nowadays, we have to fight for that freedom against the controllers of our technology. Now, we understand nowadays that big companies are too powerful, and they do lots of nasty things in society, including demanding and imposing laws that favor them against the rest of the world. And they can destroy almost anything that way. So it's proper that we condemn big companies and campaign for laws to restrict them so that they can't exercise so much power over our world. We can't have a democracy if what we really have is corporatocracy. plutocracy. So part of defending our democracy is to make sure that the very rich don't have all the power they can buy. But in addition, we have to make sure that they can't restrict us through controlling what our technology can do, and that they can't find whoever disobeys them by putting massive surveillance into our technology. Now, people have become aware of some of the habitual misuses of personal data that is collected. And there are various governments that have or plan to legislate to stop some of those specific abuses of the collected personal data. But they're all barking up the wrong tree. They all make a fundamental error that weakens these laws, and that is they focus on trying to restrict how the data are used once they're collected in a database. But that's too late, because the data once collected will be misused. There's so many ways they could be misused. By the organization that collected the data, it can misuse the data, or some rogue employee can take the data and misuse it, or through mistake they can leak the data, or some criminal can crack their system and get out the data, steal it. And governments can take the data, demand it, and misuse it. They can misuse it to crush political dissent. And we see a wave of that happening now. People making political protests or just stating their views are getting censored, even in Europe, even in the US. And we thought that this wouldn't happen anymore. So what we really need to do is require systems to be designed such that they won't collect personal data. Personal data about you shouldn't be sent to servers. Most of them should just work without knowing who you are. In Italy and in France, I've seen parking lots where if you park your car there, you're required to put in your car's license number in order to pay for a parking space. Well, that is a system of massive surveillance. It's disgusting and vicious. It's intolerable. We should put an end to that. If the general data protection regulations were any good, they would prohibit that. The fact that they don't apparently prohibit that means they're too weak. And by the way, the GDPR do not cover collection of data for, quote, security, unquote, purposes. But our security, in many cases, consists of not being tracked, especially if you don't agree with the government on every political question and you want to be free to say so. For that, we've got to make sure the government can't find out who you are. And that's hard to do if hardware and systems that don't even belong to you are keeping track of who you are and where you go and what you do and who you talk with. That's dangerous. So I say, if we want to establish privacy, we need laws that will prohibit the operation of a parking lot that keeps track of the license plate of every car, every vehicle parked there. It shouldn't know. 50 years ago, it never knew. 50 years ago, if you had to pay to park, You would put coins in a machine, and that machine would say how many minutes you paid for, and that's it. It wouldn't know who parked there. We need to bring that back. So, we find big problems nowadays in education. Schools are generally teaching non-free software, even elementary schools. If I had a child and my child came home from school with a device with non-free software in it, I would say, that can't come in here. It's not allowed in this house. Take it back to school tomorrow and don't bring it home again. Now, I wouldn't be satisfied with that. That would just be the first demand, because the school is doing harm to my hypothetical child just by teaching Per to be dependent on non-free software and teaching Per to hand over her personal data to some company that Per didn't even choose. So I would object to that. I would demand that they stop. But it doesn't end in elementary school. It goes on up through university. The same kind of injustice. Telling students to run non-free software that snoops on them and has other malicious functionalities too. For instance, Microsoft Windows. That's pretty horrible. I mean, Microsoft Windows has a universal backdoor. Microsoft can forcibly change the software. Of course, Microsoft always calls it a, quote, upgrade, unquote. But that might be a matter of opinion. We might say it's a downgrade. But either way, they have the power to put it into the poor user's machine without even asking for permission. So that's just even more clear proof that it's a malicious system, and no institution should ever encourage people to use that. And then there is Zoom. Zoom requires everybody to have an account, which means it's surveilling people. It also carries out censorship. Zoom says that it has certain conditions for whether a conversation is lawful. It's trying to interpret laws, but interpretation of those laws is sometimes controversial. There's a university in California that set up a panel discussion, an academic discussion, including someone who hijacked an airplane in the 1970s. No one was actually hurt in it, but yeah, that was a crime. Well, is that person allowed to participate in a remotely in an academic discussion? The university said yes for academic purposes. Zoom said no and turned off the conversation so that the panel couldn't happen. Now, what that law actually means in that case, I don't know. But no university should allow any company to have the power to decide that and impose that on the university. This is a surrender to power of corporations that is in the long term dangerous. So, of course, since the Zoom client program is non-free, it has all the injustices of non-free software in general that you've seen in the video. This university should never ask anyone to use Zoom. Fortunately, there is free software for these purposes. Now, I don't know whether other non-free programs that are widely used, such as Google Meet or Microsoft Teams. I don't know whether they have the same kind of censorship rules, but they certainly are non-free software, and that gives some company in each case the same kind of power over the users, and it shouldn't be. I have never used any of them. I refuse. If somebody asks me to, I say, no, it's an injustice. I won't submit to that. I won't do it. And usually, I can, if I play some important role in the activity, I can get the activity to adopt a different method. Of course, there are lots of events where I would just be one more spectator and I have no influence. Well, I guess I can't participate. But I'd rather lose out on that perhaps interesting participation as a spectator than surrender my freedom. But in fact, there's an interesting idea to work around this. A friend of mine was asked to give a talk to some official meeting, and the only way they did it was with Zoom, I think. And so he arranged for somebody else to gateway his free software conversation system to Zoom with a simple method. Somebody ran them both and did screen sharing to transmit the window from one of them to the other. And he only had to run free software. And it worked. So I don't know the details. He doesn't know the details. He's not the one who did this gatewaying. He only knows it was done using the screen sharing facility of one of these programs. But you can figure it out. And so some of you can work this out and start saying, no, I'm not going to run Zoom, but I'll be in the conversation through this gatewaying. And that way, you can make a change, but you've got to be firm about it. Firm, not flying off the handle, not yelling and screaming, but just saying, this is the way we're going to do it, because this way we have some freedom. And we'll participate in the discussion that way. It's that or nothing, you know. So I suggest that you look into doing this, work out ways, figure out which machine is going to gateway these various conversations, and at the same time, pushing for classes and other such activities to use free software to communicate. It's a step forward in freedom against something that a university shouldn't even dream of doing. But there are other problems here. I'm told that the university in many programming classes demands that students run non-free software. Well, I urge students to organize to demand that the university change. And I had some ideas for how to carry out this campaign. For instance, imagine somebody wearing a graduation outfit with Windows handcuffs on, putting them down on an anvil for somebody else to bash the chain and break it. That might be a nice image to use. Or here's another. Somebody's in a graduation outfit, kneeling on the floor in front of a toilet, throwing up Windows and other non-free programs. So, I mean, I'm sure some of you have a sense of humor too. You can think of more. The point is, keep up the pressure. Keep up the criticism. I had, once when I was in a very sad mood, sad and bitter, I thought of what I would do if I were compelled to be in a Zoom conversation, or, you know, Google Meet, it's the same thing. At the beginning of each session, I would say, I am deeply ashamed to have accepted to be part of this unjust conversation. And then I wouldn't have said anything more for the whole period of the meeting. If I were asked anything by the teacher, I would just repeat that brief sentence. And that's all. Because that would be telling the truth. If anything were such a threat to me that it would make me say yes to that, that's how I would be feeling. But with luck, you don't have to get there. In GNU.org/education, you can find various methods that students have used to avoid running non-free programs, various sorts. There's an article from a Polish student who resisted the pressure to run various non-free programs in his classes in his last year of university, and he was very persistent, very clever, and he almost totally succeeded just by continuing to push in persistent but not nasty ways. So I found it inspiring to read that. And I said, we want to publish this. So at this point, I think I will ask for questions. So, but I want them written down. And the reason is, experience says, if I ask people to speak their questions to me, I will fail to hear them about half the time. And it will take lots of time repeating before I can see what the questions are. So that's why I believe we've given out pieces of paper that you can write your questions on. And then we'll just collect them and give me stacks of pieces of paper, and I will read. Please do write carefully, though. I mean, my eyes are not perfect either. Okay. Well, as soon as there are a few, is it ready? If you've got some questions, give them to me. This is a very cryptic questions. Opinions on XZ? Well, someone discovered a clever and subtle attempt to put a malicious functionality into a free package called XZ. So there's a discussion going on about how we can be more systematic about avoiding such problems. But keep in mind, if you're comparing free software with non-free software, here we have a very rare instance of an attempt to put a malicious functionality into free software. But when you look at non-free software, the companies that own them are putting malicious functionalities into them all the time. If you run a widely available piece of non-free software, it's probably malware. So even with this lack of total perfection, we're still doing much, much, much better than non-free software is. You can't trust that at all. So comparing free software against an imaginary perfection, which real non-free software doesn't even come close to, is addressing a misleading question. And this is the important thing to remember. You know, this malicious functionality, if it hadn't been caught, would have allowed somebody to run arbitrary commands on users' machines. What does Windows do? Windows does exactly that. It has a universal backdoor. So what we see is actually an example of a very common pattern, that things that liberate people are criticized by comparing them against an unrealistic, unfair standard of perfection, while the non-freedom respecting alternative is far, far worse all the time. So you got to be ready to notice that. Is there any modern hardware with mostly free firmware? And how do you expect consumer choice to improve in this regard? Well, there is some, but you see, the problem is that there are many different devices in a computer. So this one, it has a CPU, it has a keyboard, it has a display, it has a hard disk. All of those have firmware, and we don't know how to replace that firmware at all. But fortunately, we have been able to put in free software. And one thing we have avoided with this machine is that although there are things that have non-free firmware built in, it's delivered with them. Users don't install that. It comes with that firmware inside. But we've been able to avoid ever being required to get and install a piece of non-free software. That has never happened to this machine because we use peripherals that don't do that. So in practice, that's what we can aim for. And there's a reason why this is so. Basically, when a product is sold with some software hidden inside, it's hard to tell that it's even there. And what difference in practice is there between software delivered inside the product that you can't replace and a circuit? Basically, they're equivalent. The point where they cease to be equivalent is when someone else can replace the software, but you can't. That's the point where it becomes manifestly unjust. If the firmware is basically equivalent to circuitry, meaning you can't change either one, they're equivalent in how they treat you. But when the program becomes replaceable by somebody else, then it's actively unjust. That's the point at which we need to say, no way. So if there were ever some sort of firmware upgrade for this machine, I would ignore it. Because if I accepted it and let it get installed, then I would be using a non-free program that someone else can change, but I can't. That's the point of surrender to injustice. And you'll notice that as long as I don't do things like that, nobody has the power to install malware into my machine by giving me an upgrade. So I'm protected from certain sorts of mistreatment like what Microsoft can do with Windows, the forced upgrade or downgrade. And some of them have been downgrades. A few years ago, it became impossible to make an account on a Windows machine without identifying yourself and giving various personal information, unless you knew a trick, which is that you had to make your local account with no internet connection, and it may need more than that. But if there is an internet connection, Windows will demand that you give personal data over it. So, I mean, clearly it should be illegal for a computer to demand that if you want people to have any kind of privacy. So, are there more questions? However, the area of firmware is one where we are actively fighting against attempts to make things harder. Okay, I've got a whole bunch of them now. Do you ever have any negative opinion about any of the, quote, he says Linux distributions, but they're actually GNU plus Linux distributions. Please don't, when you're talking about the system of which we are the main developers, please don't fail to mention us, the GNU project. We started this. In 1983, I announced, I want to develop a complete free software operating system called GNU. And by the time the kernel Linux came along, we were already mostly there. And so it's the GNU system with Linux as the kernel. Please don't omit GNU. You're being rather unfair to us. Now, being unfair to some contributor, that's not as bad as some other things. Like, it's not as bad as non-free software. Non-free software is an injustice, and this is merely being unfair to somebody. But still, why not avoid it? So, I have plenty of negative opinions about some GNU plus Linux distributions. And for more info, look at gnu.org/distros. You can find all that information there. What is your opinion on gaming platforms? It's very simple. Is the platform free software? Are the games free software? Because I'm not trying to judge them on anything other than whether they respect your freedom. If it's a matter of how much fun is the game, well, why should I have an opinion on that? You're perfectly capable of forming your own opinion about that. I wouldn't have time to play them anyway, and I'm not all that good at playing games, so I might just find it frustrating because I'm not that good. That's a side issue for me. The issue that matters to me is, do they respect users' freedom? Because if a game doesn't respect users' freedom, I wouldn't want to have it on my computer, and I won't have it. It isn't there. How do you reconcile free as in freedom software with paid software? Well, a lot of free software has people being paid to work on developing it. And there are various reasons why they are being paid. Some people work as contractors. They find people who want improvements. They get paid to make those improvements. Some are paid by big companies that, for various business reasons, find it useful to have that software available and being improved. There are some GNU packages which are developed mostly by people working for various different companies. I think that's great, because I'm not against paying people to program. I am against software that denies people their freedom. So there are a lot of questions people ask, like there's one in here, which come down to, suppose you have an idea for improving some program or writing a new program, but in order to do it, you need to get paid or you'd have to work in some other way. So what should you do? And for me, the answer is simple. Developing a non-free program is an attack on people's freedom in general. Now, it may be that many people wouldn't use it anyway, and so it wouldn't hurt their freedom. But some people, we presume, would use it, and they would lose freedom, and that's bad for the world. So, what's better, to develop a non-free program or not develop it? The answer, what's better is not to develop it, because then you're not harming people's freedom. You're not creating a social system that sucks people in to giving up their freedom and makes it hard for them to win their freedom back. At least do no harm. And if I think about my own possible use of it, well, if it's non-free, I won't use it. So why should I be glad it exists? No reason at all. I wish they wouldn't exist. If they do exist, they'll probably be malware. Do you have a smartphone? No, I never did. And that's because, first of all, they are portable phones, and every portable phone is tracked in its movements by the phone network. And that's inherent in the cellular protocols over the radio. There's no way to avoid that. And I don't want to be tracked. Tracking people's movements is one of the roots of repression. And it's often used against political protest and dissent. The most sensitive activity information about a person is, where did you go today? What did you do there? And who did you talk with? Tracking those things about people creates a database that is ideal for finding people engaged in dissent and punishing them and crushing civil liberties. So we need, if we want to have civil liberties, if we want to have a free society, we need to recognize that any system which does that is a threat to them. The other thing is, well, 20 years ago I learned that portable phones had software that the user couldn't replace. No, it wasn't clear how you could write any free software to put into them, even if it would let you install your own software. But there were some who knew secret keys with which to install their own changes of software, and they included governments, phone companies, and criminals. So one change that they would often install is to convert the phone into a full-time listening device that would run all the time, listen to the microphone, and transmit the audio 24 hours a day. And if you tried to turn it off, well, guess what? It would pretend to be turning off. It would display the same things it would display if it were really turning off, except it doesn't turn off. It continues listening and transmitting. So I looked at that and said, I don't want that. I'm not willing to carry that. And indeed, it causes inconvenience, but, as they say, freedom isn't free. Freedom isn't gratis, they mean. I trained myself never to use the English word free when what I mean is zero price. I trained myself to always say gratis for that. So that way, if I say free, I'm talking about freedom. Now, in Portuguese, it's clearer. In Portuguese, you say livre, and people don't think you mean zero price. So I'm trying to give English the same good characteristic. I read once online that motivation for GNU came from a printer setup at MIT. Well, partly it did. There was a printer that was controlled by free software. And the printer itself had problems, like it would often get paper jams, run out of paper. And when that happened, it might remain in a non-functioning condition for a long time. So I added a feature that when the printer control software, which ran in a separate PDP-11, when it detected that there was a paper jam or out of paper, it would communicate that to the main time-sharing computer, which would display a message on the screen of each user who was waiting for printing, saying, the printer is in trouble, go fix it. The result was the printer would not stay down for very long. Somebody would show up very soon and fix it. And the other thing was, whenever a print job finished, the PDP-11 would tell the PDP-10, which would tell the user whose job was just printed, your job such and such has been printed. So of course you could go immediately and pick it up, rather than just waiting another couple of hours because you know it often takes so long. This was a big improvement. Then we got a newer printer which was much faster, but it still got paper jams. And it printed a page a second. So in 10 minutes, well, maybe 20 minutes, it could empty its paper tray. So people needed to go there often and fill it up again, but they wouldn't know. I wanted to add the same features to the new printer that we had and appreciated in the old printer, but I couldn't because it was controlled by non-free software. Well, then I heard that there was somebody at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh that had that source code. So I was in Pittsburgh for some other reason, but I went to his office and said, hi, I'm from MIT. Could I have a copy of the printer software source code? And by the way we live, by our way of life, he should have shared it with me. But he said no. He said, no, I promise not to give you a copy. And I was so stunned, I couldn't say anything. I walked out of his office without saying one more word. But it rankled so much that I kept thinking about it. And I realized, of course, he didn't say, I promise not to give you a copy. That was the fact. But it wasn't just me. He had promised not to share with anybody. So he had betrayed the whole community and the rest of the world too, because he had signed a non-disclosure agreement. A non-disclosure agreement is, yes, please divide me from the rest of the world and help so that you can rule everybody. That's what that agreement is about. And by thinking about this, what had happened to me and what it implied more generally, I realized that non-disclosure agreements for generally useful technical information are an attack on the basis of society, which is goodwill and the general willingness to cooperate with other people. It was divide and rule at work. So this is how I came to the conclusion that, part of the conclusion that non-free software is an injustice. Because non-free software at that time, which was 1980 or so, was starting generally to be covered by non-disclosure agreements. Even for a binary that you couldn't understand anyway, you would be asked to sign a promise not to share with anybody. Now, it seems to me that asking people to agree to promises not to share with anyone is a direct attack on the cooperation, which is the basis of society. It's sabotage of society. It should be illegal. And therefore, I've been careful. I have never agreed to such a thing. I check and I say no. Put them in one stack, please. That'll be easier for me. Regarding censorship, do you believe there is a point that avoiding the proliferation of hate speech outweighs the right of individual expression? No, I think I don't like hateful words, but once you've got a system of censorship going, it's going to be used against everything that is good by those who want power. And of course, a lot of the hatred comes from those same groups and same people. I'm thinking of, for instance, the bully, the previous president of the US, who is the source of a lot of hatred and hopes to undermine society with it. But he would be in charge. If he gets into power, he'll use this. He'll define hate speech to include anything advocating freedom. Now, I have a different idea for how to avoid propagation of hatred and disinformation online, because what makes it effective is recommendation engines. Many platforms on which people communicate don't just show you whatever your friends have said, you people you said you want to pay attention to. They come up with their own ideas, which are the result of an artificial intelligence program which does machine learning and figures out what is effective to send to you to make you stay on the platform longer. And things that make you angry are very effective for that. So these recommendation engines systematically spread hatred and disinformation and anything that sabotages society. Now, I therefore came up with the recommendation that we should legally require recommendation engines to be separated from platforms. And then if you're a user of a platform, you should be able to collect the list of things that you looked at, filter it in some way, if you whatever way you like, to get a list of things you want your recommendations to be based on. Send that to some recommendation engine anonymously and get back some recommendations. And then if you want to look at some of those, you can. But there could be other competing recommendation engines, and they might not be, each recommendation engine wouldn't have to be specific to a particular platform. And what I'm hoping is that since these recommendation engines are independent of the owners of the platforms, they wouldn't have the interest to try to make people stay on a platform. This is about a license. We didn't have time to really judge this, but I think we can now, because the FSF has a person who could help in making this decision. I'm leaning to saying that this server-side public license is a non-free license, but it requires more than just me to come to a conclusion on this. For a few years, we didn't have someone to discuss it with, and now we do. Do you think students nowadays are willing to spend their time around ways to figure out how to make device run free software like drivers, etc.? Well, I don't know what you mean by students. After all, we don't need students in general to do this. We just need some people to do this. And there's still some people who are interested. The same kind of people who were interested 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. If that's what thrills you, if that's what fascinates you, you'll still do it. If you know about free software. What is your opinion on, piracy? Well, we've been seeing religious fanatics in Yemen attacking ships recently, and I think that's very bad. It's also dangerous. I mean, they sank a ship whose cargo will leak and will pollute part of the Red Sea in very harmful ways. 10 years ago, there was a lot of piracy in the theft and kidnapping form, and it was pretty much stopped by putting small groups of soldiers or mercenaries on ships so that they could fight off attempts to attack them. Piracy is very bad, but it has little to do with software. But, 100 years ago, when publishers didn't pay authors, the authors would call those publishers pirates. But in the past, say, 40 years, the publishers have been trying to turn that inside out. And now when people who are readers, listeners, etc., share, the publishers now call those people pirates, and that is absolutely wrong. What do you think about risk 5? Well, I recently learned from an expert that risk 5 is simply an instruction set design. And it's a good thing because they designed one that appears not to be patented by anyone, so you won't get in trouble and effectively lose all your work if you make an implementation of that instruction set. So that's a useful contribution, but it doesn't get you close to making a chip. There's still a lot of work to be done to get from the RISC-V instruction set to a chip design that would run it. When can we asking about the future is useless. But basically, because we can't make our own chips with today's technology, there's no reason to demand a free hardware design. If you're going to, in any case, be limited to using whatever chips factories mass produce, you can't really change a design for yourself. But that may change. In 40 years, we may all have personal chip fabricators, and then we will definitely want free designs to put into our fabricators. And free designs can be useful in checking a mass-produced chip to verify that it doesn't have hardware malware in it. And this does exist. Nowadays, the Intel processors and the AMD processors have hardware backdoors. That's why I use an old ThinkPad instead of a newer one. The newer ones have newer Intel processors, and they are known to be malware, no doubt about it. How can we promote free software ideology in the world of AI with growth of large language models? Well, actually, it's an interesting question. If you have a machine learning system, regardless of what it's for, it might be a language model, it might just be learning to recognize some patterns and act accordingly in some other fields, like the recommendation engines, they are really AIs. They understand a limited field, so they're narrow AI, but they are in my view, intelligent because they do understand the field that they operate in. The language models are not intelligence. They are good at outputting text, which is smooth and readable, and you might, if you don't know better, you might believe it came from something that was intelligent and that knows about the field it's writing about. But that's false. Those programs don't understand or know anything. And we shouldn't call them intelligence because that's what leads people to believe that this output is true, or at least tries to be true, and it doesn't. I call those systems bullshit generators. If you remember, it was not an AI, it's a bullshit generator, then you won't make the mistake of assuming any of it is true. And of course, people have figured out that they very often talk about things that just don't exist as if those things existed. And they like to call these hallucinations, but that's false also. In order to hallucinate, you have to be able to have some kind of awareness of reality, and then it has to make a mistake once in a while, and that's called a hallucination. But that's not true for a bullshit generator. The bullshit generator has no idea of what reality is. So when it outputs something that's false, that's not a hallucination. It's just a reflection of the fact that it doesn't know anything and doesn't understand anything. Anyway, one interesting question, which is what this question was aiming at, is suppose we have a machine learning system and we want to release it as free software. What do we have to include? Well, of course, there's a program to run the neural network. The source code for that has to be released. But what about the neural network itself? The system will include a trained neural network, meaning a whole bunch of weights with certain values that were made by training it on some data. So what do you have to include? Specifically, does the training data have to be included in what you release? Is that necessary in order for it to be free? My conclusion is no. And the reason is that you don't need that in order to modify this thing. You can modify it just by starting with what you got and doing incremental training. So you can modify it to work differently the way you want without having the original training data. Therefore, we don't have to insist that a free one has to include the original training data, which is a great convenience because often that would be unfeasible or impossible. What do you think about ActivityPub? I don't know what it is. Decentralized social networks. Well, I know what Mastodon is. I think that's a decentralized social network. I think it's okay. I can't read this question. Maybe it was written with invisible ink. What are your thoughts about user programs running in kernel space, especially if it is a proprietary software? Well, obviously you shouldn't allow that, but you shouldn't have any non-free software running on your computer at all, because it puts you under somebody's power, and that's an injustice, and you're the victim. It's a matter, you've probably heard about experiments with children where they say, if you can hold this treat for 5 minutes till I come back, I'll give you another one, and seeing who can succeed in doing that. Well, you could do the same thing. Here's a non-free program. It'll do this fun thing for you, but it will take away your freedom, and you'll find out the effects some years from now, if you notice them, if you don't close your eyes to them, the way most people do. So can you manage to wait till society produces a free program to give you that same pleasure? Or will you give in and make the foolish choice? They're different in details, but they're the same kind of situation. Do you have the willpower to reject a bad decision that makes you deeply vulnerable? How can you have a free software while being safe from the user itself? I don't understand that. I mean, the user is the one the program is running for, and the one who deserves to have control. I don't know what it is. How do we help the user be safe from herself? I don't think that's a problem about software design. Of course, we do have the habit, if there's some operation that is irrevocable and might be dangerous, we've learned to ask the user, are you sure you really want to do this? The results would be A, B, and C. We do this in free software. I have a feeling that there's some deep miscommunication here, but I can't guess what it is. If the government could trace back who said something, how criminals would be tracked? Well, I suppose if they track everybody, that includes criminals. It includes dissidents. Can you give us some examples of free software programs? Well, I mean, there are at least 10,000 that we have in our directory called directory.fsf.org. If you look at a distro, a free GNU/Linux distro like Triskel, you will find that it contains many thousands of packages. You can just say, install this one. Some examples that I wrote include GNU Emacs, the GNU compiler connection, the GNU debugger, and GNU Make, and a bunch of others. How can we step towards more free/Libre hardware, especially CPU architectures? Well, you just have to do the work. It would be nice to have an implementation of RISC-V instruction set with a free circuit design. That would take us a step towards being able to make chips somehow that we could be confident don't have backdoors. If data collection is done to develop software that could, for example, avoid accidents or predict medical conditions, do you consider it malicious? Well, what kinds of data is it really? If a program is looking at a tissue sample to judge whether it's cancerous, I don't think that's malicious data collection, because they're not going to do it to everybody. They're only going to get a sample from you if doctors think you may have cancer and prescribe a biopsy. And at that point, this is not massive data collection. And the only thing they'd find out is whether you have cancer in that part of your body. They won't find out where you went today or what you did there or who you talked with. Those are the sensitive things that are really dangerous to collect. On the subject of streaming disk services, is all software free? And I'm afraid I have so much trouble reading this. Please try again. In a world where a game is as easy to copy and distribute as it is to purchase, how would a company recoup its investment? Well, I think it's the wrong question because it starts from the wrong priorities. This question assumes that it's good for the game to exist, whether it's free or not, and I don't think it's good for a non-free program to exist. And it doesn't take account of the fact that running a non-free program is opening yourself up to various kinds of injustice and mistreatment. So I would say, if the game's not free, I'm not going to run it anyway, so I'm perfectly content if it never gets written. Free mobile phones. Well, it's not clear what that would mean. You see, we have a definition of free software. Is this particular program free software? Well, we know what that means. But a mobile phone or any other product which is hardware and has software in it, well, that's a combination of many things. And I am not sure what it means to say that a phone is or isn't free. I know what it means to ask whether, of course, the physical hardware is a combination of various different designs. Like maybe there are a few boards. Each board's design might be free, and there are probably several chips. And each of those chips might be a combination of several different designs made by different designers, and each of them might be free or not. At that level, the questions are meaningful. But what does it mean to put them all together and ask whether the phone is free? Which of these designs actually matter to us in moral terms? So, as a practical matter, I know that no mobile phone is without non-free malware. They have to have malicious software in them. Your opinions on WikiLeaks, and I don't know what that is. I admire WikiLeaks, and I admire Julian Assange. Please sign letters to demand his release. Please tell the government of Portugal that you wanted to demand his release. What's on trial is not just one particular person, it's the freedom to report on secret government injustices when you find out about them. I think this is a repeat. Do you have an opinion on the business source license from MarioDB? I don't know that license. Sorry. Let's assume some non-tech savvy person is fully convinced of the free software cause. Basically, all free software assumes its users have at least some degree of tech savviness. No, that's not true. You don't have to know any programming or wizardry to use free software. Free software can be as easy to use as anything else. But at the moment, I'm going to have to leave this and come back in a minute because I gotta go. See you in a minute. I'm back. Time for more questions. So, how is the general public expected to embrace free software if most of it requires knowledge 95% of people don't have? Well, part of the knowledge they don't have is how malicious the other software is. So indeed, that encourages them to use non-free software. If only they knew, if only there were campaigns to make people aware of just how bad the non-free software is, then they might turn to free software instead. And we should all do that. That's why it's very good to be an example of rejecting some non-free software and telling people just how nasty it is, how unjust it is. But basically, you don't have to be a wizard to use GNU plus Linux. There are people around. When you occasionally need some help, there are people who can help you. And you probably can even find someone in the community who can help you, and it won't cost anything. But if you don't, there are people you can pay. What is your opinion about Web3/blockchain? I'm not sure what Web3 means. I think it's a marketing buzzword. But blockchain, well, I'm not an expert on blockchain. I know that Bruce Schneier said it doesn't enable you to do anything that you couldn't do without it. I suppose he knows what he's talking about. It may have advantages for some things, I don't know. You see, that's a technical question. I'm not for or against the use of blockchain as a technique in a program, because I'm concerned with the issues of justice, which are more or less orthogonal to the question of how you write your program to work. Is it GNU/Linux or GNU plus Linux? Either one's okay. They both express the same point. Some of the surveillance methods you've mentioned have helped detect and prevent, I don't know what. Is any kind of surveillance I don't know, something violation of personal freedom? Well, there's certain kinds of information it's okay for the state to have, like keeping track of who owns a car, who owns that house. They need to tax you for it, and so on. The most sensitive information, the most dangerous for the state or any company to know is, where did you go today? What did you do when you were there? And who have you talked with today? Tracking that sort of information puts the organization collecting the data in a position very easily to repress people. And the temptation is hard for governments to resist. And the danger is that your country ends up like China. China is extremely repressive, arrests people for almost nothing if it seems politically inconvenient for them, for the person to be doing that, and then will torture the person into confessing to anything whatsoever and keep the person in prison for ages. What about critical systems software? Shouldn't it be, he wrote closed, but I don't talk about closed or open to categorize software. Shouldn't it be secret and under an NDA? Well, not really. It's not good security to be using something secret. It's more likely to be correct if a lot of people use it. But I'm not saying that an organization has to release all software it develops for its own internal use. You don't have to release all software you write for your own use. So I say that a non-free program is an injustice, but an unreleased program, well, if you wrote it, it's free for you, and nobody else has a copy, so there's nobody for whom it is not free. But if you were going to release copies of it, you should release them as free software, because if not, because that's the point at which you would be doing injustice to other people, is if you distribute copies and deny those people the freedom to change their own copies or to share their own versions. What is your opinion on System 76's attempt to create hardware alternatives to AMD and Intel? I've never heard of System 76, so I have no information. But I hope you can figure out what I would say based on what I've said about free software. The university has something complicated business bureaucracy and collects lots of data, but fails to do useful things with the data. Well, I don't know, this is too vague for me to judge. I mean, is it harmful for the university to have that data? It might be, but maybe it isn't. It depends on what the data is. If it happened a few times, things like how to ask the university I can't understand the word here. Something you've a student just to give back to the university, just to give it back to the university. I don't know what giving back, give what back? Submit empty files with no information just because it is in the regulation, otherwise you fail to be admitted. It sounds like this is annoying, useless bureaucracy. Well, annoying, useless bureaucracy is certainly annoying, but things can be worse than annoying. If they're requiring you to run Windows, that's worse than annoying. So we've got to recognize that there are different levels of badness. Bureaucratic rigmarole that could have been avoided is not as bad as injustice. If you self-host free software to avoid taking proprietary alternative in the... Do you self-host free software to avoid, I don't know what it's, to avoid a proprietary alternative? I don't understand. I don't need to host the software I run. I get the software in my computer from the Treescale distribution, and I don't need to have my own server to download it from. I download it from the standard place. Now, maybe this question is really about certain kinds of network services. I have a website. It's hosted by a company run by somebody who is a supporter. Now, if it were not for that, I guess I'd have to pay for the same kind of hosting, but that's okay. I mean, I could pay. So I don't need to do it myself. And that's convenient for me because I don't know how to run a web server and do a good job. I've never needed to learn that, and I'm glad I never needed to learn that because I can do something else useful with the time. And likewise, I don't need to host my own email service. The Free Software Foundation runs an email service. I use that. It's hosted by people I trust. It's maintained by people I trust. I'm sure they do a better job than I could. In this way, I don't need to learn how to do that. Do you use a credit/debit card? Well, I have them, but I very rarely use them. When I buy products, I pay cash anonymously. And that's a matter of principle. If I pay cash, the store doesn't know who I am, and therefore I'm not being tracked and surveilled. Now, I do pay some bills by check to utilities, for instance, and medical clinics. They know who I am. In the case of utilities, they demand to know, but all they know about me is where I live, which the city knows anyway. And the clinics, they need to know who I am so they can communicate with each other about my medical problems. And that's very important that they do so. But I am concerned that it's too easy for others to get their hands on information about my medical situation. I don't use their websites. I don't trust their websites. They try to run non-free software in my browser, and I never allow that. So that's something that needs to be changed. I have to keep telling them, no, if you post something in that system, I will not see it. You need to tell me some other way. What do you think are the biggest benefits of free software for companies? Well, suppose you have a company and you use software, as a lot of companies do. If you're using non-free software, someone else has power over you and will screw you the way it would screw individuals. So the benefit of free software is that you're not under anybody's thumb like that. Is there a world where companies can be more lucrative with free software? If the software you're using is free, you're going to be better off in all sorts of ways. Of course, there may be an assumption in this question that wasn't stated. It may be, instead of asking about companies and software, it may intend to ask about software developers and software. But I think it's wrong if that's what it's about, if it's about the companies that develop software and not the larger number of companies that use programs, then I think it's making a mistaken assumption that the most important thing about software is how much money its developer will make. In fact, I have friends who have a web development cooperative. They develop websites for organizations, and they do it with free software, and the software they write is free software also. Whatever they put on your website for you, they release to you as free software. They still get paid. And that's a big business opportunity for developing free software. Of course, it's not general purpose free software. It's very specific free software developed for a certain organization to do what that client asks for. The point is that that's a large fraction of all paid software development, and it works just fine with free software. So there are no more questions. So I guess I'm done. So I should remind you that there are some FSF products for sale up there. And are there any stickers left? I can't tell what the answer is. Is it yes or no? There are still stickers left. The stickers are gratis and you can take them. And you can put them in various places where people might see them, and that will help spread the word. By the way, you can also join the Free Software Foundation. That's help that we need. You can do that, well, you could do that here paying cash, but you can also do it through fsf.org. Our website is one of the few websites where you can make a payment and you don't have to run any non-free software to do it. We've been very careful about that. If we ever asked members of the public to run a non-free program, it would put us in a moral contradiction. So we are careful never to do that. Recently, I gave a talk, and the organizers wanted to use an internet-based system for people to suggest questions and then vote on the importance of different questions. They weren't used to people who would answer dozens and dozens of questions like me. They figured I would get just a few questions, and they wanted those to be the ones that most people in the audience wanted to have answered. But I found that the system they wanted to use requires people to be running non-free software. And I said, I won't do that. I will not cooperate with imposing non-free software on people. So we collected the questions on paper, and I got a big stack of paper. And I'm sure the questions that a lot of people were interested in were written down several times each, and so I certainly came across them. So I guess we're done. Happy hacking, everyone. I suggest having a protest against university requirements to run non-free software every week. Show that you mean it by being persistent.